When we talk about resumes, we're talking about your employment and academic history. When you type the word resumes, it should have the accents above both of the E's. Otherwise, the word resumes. I will give you a fair warning that when I type this over and over and over again in the PowerPoint, I don't have it set up to autocorrect to that, so it's just going to look like the word resumes. Just forgive me. It's tedious to type that many times and with the accents and everything. Maybe it's a little bit lazy, but there we go. But when you do type resumes in a formal setting, it needs to be corrected to have the accents above both of these. So the resume, what's the big deal? The big deal is that the resume is that employment and academic history. It is a timeline of what you have done academically and occupationally. So you want to show academic credentials and awards. I always include my GPAs. Maybe I shouldn't say always. Most of the time, I include my GPAs because I feel like if there's going to be something that can help set me apart from somebody else, it's going to be my GPA. And I include my GPA for my bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degrees. And also if you graduated with any kind of honors, like at an undergraduate level, you can graduate with honors. So it's cum laude, magna cum laude, summa cum laude. And then if you're in a master's program, sometimes they'll have the same graduation with honors. So you have the cum laude, summa, or magna cum laude, summa cum laude. And at the doctorate level, you almost never see that. You usually just have a graduation with distinction, which is usually somewhere in the 3.8 and above range for GPA. So I include those, even though they may not ask for it. And they're also, if you're going to apply for a job, usually you're going to send an official transcript anyways. But you know what? If someone's screening resumes, I want them to see my GPA there. If you have a GPA that's not the greatest, so maybe your GPA is below a 3.0, maybe you don't want to put it on there because you're going to be competing with a lot of people that probably have GPAs in the upper threes to maybe even 4.0. So you want to make sure that if you have a sub 3.0 GPA, use discretion as whether or not you include that in that as well. You also want to talk about your job history and your achievements at jobs. I would also include internships. If you don't have a job history, you want to show that you have some kind of experience in your field. Then you also want to talk about, the practicum and internship experiences, specifically if you don't have any other job history, or you can also include it in the academic history if you have other jobs. So maybe your first resume, all you have for experience is your practicum and internship. That can go in a separate section. If you have had several jobs, maybe you can put your practicum and internship experiences as part of your academic history. So at Olivet College, if you had an internship, then you can include it as part of your academic history rather than your employment history. Some general guidelines that won't surprise you. Make it easy to read. You want to use the same kind of font and formatting as you did for your cover letter. You want to customize it for the position. So a lot of times your resumes will be the same as far as the content, but sometimes the focus of it changes, and the way that you talk about what you did in school, or the way that you talk about your accomplishment-focused aspects of your jobs, or even your introductory statement about why you're applying for the job or what you're looking to do as part of the job, or whatever it is, that can be customized for the position. But generally, all the content will remain the same because obviously you're not going to select which schools you talk about or which jobs you talk about. You're going to want to put them all in there. It needs to be clear and concise. One of the problems that we often see with resumes is that there's a lot of variation even within the formatting and the way that you talk about your jobs in the resume itself. Forget about the fact that there are many different types of ways to do resumes. We want to make sure that we are considering consistency above all in your own resume. So how can you customize your resume? Good question. The way that you can customize your resume is by using keywords for the job. There is nothing wrong with using the job posting as a way to take away phrases that will be key phrases that you talk about in the resume. So if you're talking about getting a position, working with, let's say that you want to apply for a position at Safe Place where you're working with abused families, or families that are in danger. and you have some experience working with something like, or maybe you took a course in crisis management or something like that. You can use the same words that they're talking about, where you are providing crisis services and triage services to families in need. You can say that you talked about crisis and triage in that crisis management class. So use the same wording in the job posting that you have some kind of expertise in or some kind of familiarity with. So if the wording is changed for different job postings, make sure that you update your resume when necessary to include the same kind of wording, so that when you're getting screened by some kind of employment supervisor or agent, then it will show that you are very fit for this position by merit of your experience. Also, if you are having your resume screened by a program, it will pick out those keywords and search for them, and you'll have some kind of match characteristics, and your match will be greater if you have the same words that they're looking for in their job posting. So those applicant tracking systems will automatically screen things out in and out. So try to think like a computer. You want to emphasize your recent experience, usually in the last 3 to 5 years, or if you've had a job for a long time, maybe longer than that. But the idea there is to maybe give a little bit more focus as to the accomplishments that you have in the last 3 to 5 years, and a little bit less focused on the others. After you've gotten 3 or 4 jobs, you're probably going to run out of room on your resume. Resumes can be a little bit longer than 1 page, and that's okay. But generally, we want to keep them to 1, maybe 2 pages, depending on how much experience you have. So the general formatting, good segue, leads us into the number of pages that we have, 1 or 2 pages based on the amount of experience. I try my hardest to keep my resume to 1 page. It can be difficult, but generally it's okay. If I am going for a position, or if I'm trying to get into a grad school and they want a resume, I will focus on making it a little bit more detailed, a little bit more elaborate, and it might run over into the second page. A general rule of thumb is that if you have 2 pages, make it at least a half a page. So you have 1 full page and then a second half a page. You don't want to have like 1 or 2 lines going onto the second page. It doesn't look very balanced. Alternatively, if you've put everything you can possibly put on there and it's like 1 1/4 pages, mess with your spacing between your sentences. Make it, instead of single space, you can set it to 1.2 space, and you can kind of squeeze everything off of the first page and move it onto the second page, and you can kind of more or less cheat your way into getting 2 pages. By the way, don't try that with assignments, because I will bust out the formatting key and I will open up your assignment in Microsoft Word, and it'll tell me exactly how far apart your sentences are and things like that. Remember, I can think like a student. I've been a student, so I know how that works. No grammar or spelling errors. Obviously, that's another one of the things that we should probably not have to talk about, but there shouldn't be any grammar or spelling errors. 11 to 12 point font that's accessible, same as your cover letter. So you need to use Times New Roman, Calibri, Arial, Verdana, or Tahoma. There probably are a couple of other fonts that you can use, but the APA recommends those for any kind of writing. Because it's accessible, people who have difficulty reading can read those fonts quite easily. The fancy fonts are the fonts that have, they're called serif, so the little tails on the end of letters and things like that can be difficult. For example, the word formatting, I think, is written in Times New Roman, and this is in the, and everything else is written in Calibri, I believe. Let me check that out. Oh, nope, it's Franklin Gothium or whatever it's called. Gothic book, okay. Yeah, so, but anyways, it's a sans serif formatting. You don't see all those little tails on there. But when you look at this, when you see all the tails at the ends of the F and everything. So these fonts will include them or not, depending on what the font is, but excessive tails on your font can be difficult to read. You can use graphics tables, borders, and shading but do it effectively. Make sure that it works well. Shading is not always very effective because it can be difficult, especially if you print it out. Don't use colors for sure, though. If you end up using colors and it gets printed out on a black and white printer, it just looks like weird shading, or maybe it looks like the toner's going bad or something. So just use one font type and one color. You can use bold, that's okay to do, but generally you want to, whatever you do for these, you want to use it effectively. By the way, some of the rationale, I guess, for using tables and graphics and borders for a resume is that there's a lot of information there. It can be difficult to sort it out. So make sure that when you are using these graphics, tables and borders, that it's to set your information apart, not just to make it look fancy. Most people who read these resumes want to just see things. They want to see chunks. They want to have their eyes drawn to certain things. They don't care that it looks pretty. They just want to know where the information is. Again, you can use italics and bolts if you want to. And again, avoid templates. So just like the cover letters, try to avoid templates because the application tracking systems will automatically look at those and they'll recognize them as templates, and they will give them less priority because it looks like they were just produced. And they are. Normally you just type in your information, then you click go, and it'll throw it all into a format. So make sure that you're doing your own from scratch. It's a good skill to have anyways. More on formatting. There's a lot on formatting, by the way. Use consistent formatting across other application documents. Again, make your cover letter the same font and everything, and the same font size as your resume. So try to keep them all consistent. You will use single spacing and a space between paragraphs that do not have an indentation. So when you do paragraphs, do not indent the paragraphs. Just make them all aligned to the left. Use bullet points rather than paragraphs in most cases on your resume. There is a time where you can use, oh good, we're having a Zoom session. There is a time where you can use paragraphs, but use them very sparingly, and I would almost bet my bottom dollar that it's better to use bullet points 90% of the time, especially when you don't have a lot of information to talk about. So just use bullet points. There are a lot of possible aspects to put into your resume. You may not use them all, but it would be important for you to become familiar with them so that when you do have some credentials and some experience, you can add it. So this is a bullet list. We're going to go through each one in some detail. So pay close attention to them as we go through. We're going to start with personal information. So you want to have your name, a phone number, an email address at the top of the first page of the document. Address is optional, but I include it for mailing purposes. That way you don't have to get another correspondence for the email. And even though I have an Olivet College mailbox, I don't use it for things generally that I need to pay a lot of attention to. I'd rather have it sent to me at my house. So I'll include my home address. I do use my Olivet College email address and my Olivet College phone number for most business purposes that are related to academics. Even though I'm not on campus to answer my phone, it goes to voicemail, and I'd rather respond that way anyways, and I don't want to have my cell phone flooded with those kind of calls. So think about how you want people to contact you. And include an email address. That's very helpful too. You can include your LinkedIn profile on this as well. That's kind of optional, but most of the time we're leaning toward it. So whenever you can, include a LinkedIn profile, even though it's not strictly required for this. And just a note on emails, if you have an email address from middle school that's like sparkleprincess24@yahoo.com, don't use that. You'd be surprised at how often I see emails come across from people who have clearly very old email addresses. So make sure that you have a professional email address. If you don't have one yet, Gmail is free. You can probably find some variation of your name that will work for email. Alternatively, if you want to, you can have an email address that's connected to a domain that you purchase on the internet. I have several emails that I use for different purposes, and Some of them are professional, some of them are part of a small business, but you could come up with any domain you wanted to and have emails go to it. My wife and I both have doctorate degrees, so we have a website that's called drhaggerty.com, DOCTOR, Haggerty.com. And we have subdomains. Mine is will.drhaggerty.com. My wife's is leslie.drhaggerty.com. We have our own emails that go to those. So you could email me, will@drhaggerty.com, and it's a professional sounding email address. It's my own, and I don't have to have like will, 1983 at gmail.com, because will at gmail.com is clearly not going to be available. One of my Gmail addresses is whaggerty7. I got lucky to have that, but that's just how it goes. So make sure that when you have an email address that is professional and that it makes some sense. If your document does run into 2 pages long, include a heading with your name and the number and the word page 2 at the top of the second page. So it'll be Haggerty page 2 at the top of the second page. That will work just fine. That way, if your document gets printed and separated, it knows the people know where it goes to. So the first thing you start with is a summary statement, and you can think of a summary statement just as a brief introduction as to why you are going to be a good candidate for the position. And it can usually be 1 to 2 sentences, not really much more than that. And it just goes at the top, right underneath your header. Probably would have some kind of like line, like a division bar that would separate your header from the rest of the content. But you just want to say what you have for the job, and that's what needs to be tailored to the position. So that needs to be a different bit of information that is going to be on each resume tailored for the position that you're applying to. Try to update that every time you send out a resume. A good rule of thumb is to have a resume template that has all of your, when I say resume template, what I mean is your resume as you've designed it, ready to be used for different things, not to use a resume template like from what Word gives you. Anyways, I just wanted to clarify that because earlier I said no templates. What I mean is use your own produced resume as a template. But you're going to want to save it, and then when you send out a resume, you will update that template that you've created for yourself, and then update the information as it needs to go out to each place that you're applying. And remember, it needs to be customized for the job. So if, again, I'll use the example, if you're applying for a job at Safe Place and you want to work in the triage or crisis department, you'll say something like, I'm excited to be applying for a position working in the triage department, which will allow me to exercise the things that I've learned at Olivet College. Hopefully yours sounds more eloquent than that, than what I'm saying off the cuff, but you can kind of see that the summary statement is kind of like, it's almost like an introduction to why you're a good candidate, and more like you're pre-thanking the individuals who are looking. So thank you for letting me apply. Here's what I can do for you. So you can say, I'm glad to have the opportunity to apply to this position, ... Then say why. And obviously, again, customize for the job. You'll include your work experience, and generally this is pretty easy for undergrads. You haven't had a lot of work experience. If you had a relevant job that you've had before college or even in college, you can include that. I've known some people that have worked as psych techs without a bachelor's degree, which is kind of cool to be able to do, so you could include that. Some people have worked in nursing facilities or in direct care facilities as they've been in college. That's cool too. Include that information. If you worked at the movie theater, probably not the best thing to include on your resume, even though it's the only job you may have had. However, maybe if you're a manager of a movie theater, that could be helpful because that can speak to your ability to work with individuals and to manage people. I don't know that customer service is really meets the criteria for entry-level credentials in a job, but I suppose if you were just working at the movie theater and you had good customer service, that could be an okay thing to add. Just use your discretion. If you think that your job is completely irrelevant or wouldn't add to your resume, don't include it. I don't think that including an irrelevant job for the sake of having a job on your resume is worth it. You'll want to include your job title, the name of the employer, city and state of the location and the dates that you were working there. Lots of times for the dates you can use months and years. That's okay to do too. If you worked at a job for years and years and years, like for example, I worked at Michigan Psychotherapy for 10 years from 2009 to 2019, I don't think it's necessary that I put that I worked from July of 2009 to September of 2019. The months don't become very relevant at that point. But if you had 4 or 5 jobs in the span of 5 years, maybe it would be important for you to put the months so that you can show that you had continuity between your jobs. So you had job 1 from January of 2019 to August of 2019, and then you had another job from September of 2019 to April of 2020. That's good to put in there because what it does is it says that you went from a job to another job with no lapse in between it. Gaps in your job history can look kind of suspicious, so make sure that that when you have a job history that you're including months if it's relevant, and if it's not, then you don't need to. You want to align all of the dates in the right margin, meaning that if somebody were to look down the right side of your resume in your experience portion, they could look at the timeline that you have for your jobs. It's very nice to be able to look down and see when you had your jobs, et cetera, et cetera. Ooh, there's going to be a concert. Look at that. You can use italics, bolded capitalization to your job titles and employment settings to help them stand out. That's completely fine to do here. You can be a little bit creative there. Don't get too fancy or cute with it because it can become unreadable, and keep it consistent in each instance. So if you have the employer capitalized in one instance, make sure it's done in the other. Same thing with simple things like ending sentences. You can choose to end a sentence with a period or not, but keep it consistent. As I'm now looking through mine, recognizing that sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. There, happy now? Okay. More on your job experience. You want to have what's called a job scope statement. So if you have experience working somewhere, for example, I worked at Summit Point, which is a community mental health facility that serves Southwest Michigan, specifically Calhoun County. The job scope statement comes afterwards, and it talks about the accomplishments it talks about what you did in that particular job, starting with a verb. So they call it an action word sometimes. It's a verb. So this is an example of another one, but coach and counsel troubled youth as part of a 10-person team delivering a summer camp experience for young men and women from disadvantaged communities. Okay, that's a job scope. That's what you did. If I were going to do mine from Summit Point, I would say that I provided assessment and therapeutic interventions for individuals from 18 to 65. Oh, I guess I'd see older than that. I think I was limited to 65. 18 to 65 using psychodynamic interventions. Okay, so just some kind of job scope statement. What did you do? You don't have to go on and on and on about all of your job duties. Just what basically they want to know, what is the 1 or 2 sentence description of your job. But start it with an action word. That way it indicates that you did something. Okay. Don't describe the employer. So I wouldn't say something like Summit Point, community mental health facilities serving people of all ages from various socioeconomic statuses. Okay, cool. That's about Summit Point, not about me. So make sure you start with what you did there.
Sorry, I didn't understand.
I'm not talking to you, Google. Stinking eavesdropping. What did I say? Okay. So, experience. You also want to talk about your accomplishment-focused bullet points. So after you have your job scope statement, what you did there, what were some of the things that you did at that job that will make you stand out? So you want to use bullet points rather than paragraphs. And if I were you, I would try to keep the sentence to 1 line, although they can go to multiple lines, that's okay. But remember, you're talking about saving space. So begin with the present tense action word. They're verbs. So start with the present tense verb describing the current experiences, and past tense that talk about previous experiences. It seems to make sense, but some people get confused as to how they should write those. So if something happened in the past, use the past tense. If something is happening now or is an ongoing experience, use the present tense. Use consistent punctuation, again, periods at the end of sentences or not, but keep it consistent. And it's okay in a resume to not have a period end a sentence, especially if your sentence isn't a sentence. Sometimes you have a bullet point that's just a little bit of information, maybe not a complete sentence. But remember, if you're using an action word, then you're probably going to have a sentence anyways. So an example of what this might look like is designed marketing and promotional brochures, improving brand awareness and increased market share. Probably for somebody who is doing some kind of advertising job, which is well within the scope of what we can do as psychologists, especially industrial organizational psychologists. Also, reduced annual training costs by creating and implementing new training curriculum. Okay, cool. Sometimes you might not be able to think about what you did at a job that makes it like an accomplishment focused idea, but generally there is something that you've contributed that you can use. Even if it's about productivity. So you can say something like, at some point we use scorecards to talk about productivity. We get bonuses based on that. So you could say something like, met 95% productivity for 3 quarters in a row. That's important. Had all satisfactory marks on our customer surveys. Something like that would be important to know. There's lots of things that you can talk about that would be important. If I were going to talk about accomplishments like working at Olivet College, I could say something like successfully produced and had passed a curriculum revision for a Master's in Mental Health Counseling program, or was awarded Adjunct Instructor of the Year in 2015. I could include those kinds of accomplishments, and they reflect on what you do as an employee, not necessarily just tooting your own horn, but it talks about what you have done and can do as an employee. Moving on to education, when you talk about your education, in that section you want to include the degree name, the name of the institution, the city and state of the institution, and the year you graduated. If you haven't graduated yet, then you can say expected and then whatever year it is. You could even include the month if you know what it is. Generally, as an undergrad, you pretty much know when you're going to graduate. It's either May or December. But if you get into a master's program or a doctorate program, you can graduate lots of different times. For example, I graduated with my doctorate in November because you graduate when you complete the requirements, not necessarily having to wait however long it is until the graduation date is. In my master's program, we only graduated classes every year in May. So it just depends. So if you want to include the month, you can, but generally the year is just required. So you want to list your degrees in reverse chronological order, starting with the most recent degree. What that also does theoretically is puts the highest degree on top. So if you have your bachelor's degree and your high school diploma, you can include your bachelor's degree from Olivet College, Olivet, Michigan. Well, I guess if we start at the beginning, it'd be a degree name, wouldn't it? So the degree name is Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from Olivet College, Olivet, Michigan, and expected graduation 2020, which is probably safe for most people in this class, maybe taking a senior seminar early, and perhaps you might be graduating in 2021. Either way is okay. Only list your formal degrees. Oh, I'm sorry. I was kind of listing in reverse chronological order. And then next would be a high school diploma. So I graduated from Marshall High School. So you have a general diploma, Marshall High School, Marshall, Michigan, 2002. It's a long time ago. Wow, it's a long time ago. Excuse me. Now I'm having flashbacks. Oh, God. Okay, so only formal degrees should be listed. So certifications and training. So if you got trained in something or if you have a certification, I know that with that there's a human trafficking class that we have, and I don't know for sure if you got any kind of training or certificate for that, but if you did, that goes in a different place, not in your education section. Your education is about earning degrees from formal institutions. If you think that you have if you think that you have more educational history than employment history, you can include that right after the summary statement. So it just depends on what you are applying to. So if you're applying to a job that is academic like. So if let's say that you wanted to become a professor and you wanted to go apply somewhere, if you wanted to maybe do adjunct instruction somewhere, then you would list your academic credentials first. Or maybe you wanted to do like substitute teaching, you would include your academic credentials first. But if you're going to a job, you might want to include your work experience first. It just depends on what the focus is of your resume. And again, there's no right way to order those, but if I were you, I would do my educational history first, because that's probably going to be more substantial than your work history. So next is professional development, and you could cluster these together with professional development, including things like certificates, awards, and things like that, if you wanted to. But generally, professional development includes you being a part of some kind of organization, society, or whatever. So if you're a member of Psi Chi, that could be something that you are including in that section. Or if you have done some kind of professional service, maybe you've done some kind of consultation. Sometimes you can include what you've published as a result of it. That's okay to do. If you're a member of the American Psychological Association, you can include that. If you had any leadership positions, you can include that as well. So if you've been an officer in any organization, club, group, society, sports team, sorority, fraternity, whatever it is, you can include that under professional development as well. Again, if that's a section in your resume, you can also cluster it with others if it's relevant. Keeping it separate takes up space because you have that header that's repeated multiple times. So just remember that. We are concerned about space. Community involvement can also include volunteer work, and you could also, by the way, put this in with professional development. That'd be okay. They don't have to be like separated out completely. Include relevant volunteer work. So if you did something for Service Day, you can include that. If you went on like an alternative spring break, you can talk about that as well. If you did anything that's not related to Olivet, then you can talk about what you did to volunteer there as well. Talk about the name of the organization and the dates of your involvement. Even if it's a short volunteer experience, you can still include the dates. So say something like, for spring break of 2019, we went to Heifer Ranch or something like that, and talk about the dates and maybe a little bit about what you did there. Again, talk about the leadership positions that you held if you were involved in any kind of volunteer opportunity. You can also talk about presentations that you've done. So if you have done a more formal presentation, I'm not sure that I would include simple class presentations unless it was a formal presentation. Let's see, probably the least substantial presentation that would be reasonable would be the presentation you did for research methods if you did one in that class. That would probably be the least that I would include. Other than that, if you did some kind of presentation for your class, if you were a speaker at commencement or at convocation or anything like that, you can include it. But include whatever the title of the presentation was, the event title and location, the number of attendees, and the dates. If you don't know what the number of attendees were, you can probably estimate. So if it were something like convocation, you could say that there were over 1,000 people there. That'd be pretty substantial. If it were something like baccalaureate, maybe it's more like in the 100 to 200 range. If it were at commencement, you might be talking about 2,000 or 3,000 people, depending on how many people show up. That might be a little bit high for our commencement. But we do have a lot of people at commencement. Think of it. There are at least 60 faculty and 200 graduates. That's 250 right there. Plus, if every graduate had a couple of parents with them, now you're up to 750, and maybe a little bit more if you have other folks that show up. So 1,000 is probably not bad. Okay, certification. So if you have a certification in some kind of field, and maybe that could also be where you would put a human trafficking certificate if you got that. You would talk about the licensing body, etc. You might not have a lot of opportunities as an undergraduate to get certified in anything, but if you did, that's where it would go. You can also talk about specialized trainings that you've received. Again, if you think that something like human trafficking would go in that, you can include it there. Specialized trainings could also include formal trainings like CPR, or basic first aid. If you took a class of basic first aid, I think you get certified in CPR and basic life-saving skills, so BLS. You can include that there as well. there are probably others that you know about that I don't know that you've experienced. So if you have any questions on what specialized trainings might be, you can include those, and we can talk about them. And then we have technical skills. So if you have any kind of technical skill that you've learned, so if you have some kind of specialized skill in a computer program, for example, in SPSS, you can include that. Don't oversell how much you know about your technical skill, but certainly do include the fact that you are familiar, proficient, and expert, or whatever it is in whatever technical skill you're talking about. If you wanted to talk about SPSS, you could probably say that you are familiar with and have working knowledge of SPSS because you've all worked with that. If not, if you don't remember working with SPSS and stats, we need to talk. But you can include that if you would like to. If you are talking about something that you only know about or have used once or twice, maybe you want to leave it off. Also include language skills. If you are conversational or fluent in a language, please by all means include it. This includes spoken and symbolic language. So if you know how to sign, so if you're fluent in some kind of sign language, whether it's ASL or it's signing perfect English or whatever it is, then you can include that. But also include your level of expertise or proficiency in that. Again, don't oversell yourself, because if an institution is hiring you because you said that you are conversational in Spanish, you better be conversational in Spanish. The Bethany Christian Services in Grand Rapids has several sites, and some of them work with immigrants and children of immigrants that have been isolated for whatever reason, and you need to be conversational in certain languages. So please don't oversell your proficiency. Or if you're kind of on the border, maybe you were fluent or conversational in Spanish but kind of aren't anymore, bone up on it. Spend a few $100 and get a really good program that will help you to bone up on it. That way when you get into your job, you can lean on that qualification. And interestingly, people will try to include references, or at least snippets of references, like maybe names and email addresses, or it'll have a line that says something like references upon request. You really don't need to include that in your resume. I don't think that there's an employer out there who's going to think that you don't have any references because you didn't include them on your resume. It's assumed that you're going to provide them elsewhere anyways on an application, so you don't really need to include them on your resume. And the other thing is that you really ought to be contacting your references every time you think about using them. So when you have a resume that just has 3 references on it, you might get comfortable with just sending it out. I oftentimes will get letters from employers that are asking me to fill out a reference for somebody. Generally, I have no problem doing it because I pretty much remember people. But the reality is that if you've been out of school for 5 years, I don't know what you've been doing. I can't talk about the things that you've recently been doing and kind of link to that. So it's important that when you are looking at applying and you have to include your references, send them an email and say, hey, how's it going? I know it's been a while, but I'm applying to this position. I was wondering if you'd be able to say nice things about me. Here's what I've been up to for the last several years. That's the important part of the references part of a resume, is to have current ones that can talk nice about you, not just throwing names for the sake of having them available on a resume. You don't even need to include that phrase again, that references are available upon request. That kind of goes without saying. It'd be silly if the employer says to you, hey, do you have any references? Because we're going to request them. And you say, oh, gee, I don't really. I didn't think about that. That would be a tremendous oversight. So make sure that you're familiar with your references and you can include them via email. And generally anymore, you fill these out online. You might upload your resume, but there'll be a form and it'll say, please list your references and their email addresses. And you'll do that. And that's how they contact us. Okay, so that's all for resumes. There are lots of resources available to you in the resumes folder. Please be familiar with those because we're going to talk about your resumes in class and we're going to tie some things in. If you have a resume and would like to bring it to class, that would be really cool to do. Maybe we could screen share it or something so that other people could see it too. So if you have a resume that you want to submit through email, that would be fine, and I could just use that to share it with other people and we could talk about it. there is an assignment that's linked to your resume as well. So we are going to be going through them with a fine-tooth comb using the criteria that we have here, as well as a checklist that will help you to rate one of your peers' resumes. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing your resumes.